Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and have this opportunity to share some thoughts with this group of people. I'm going to talk about something really quite simple. I mean, basically the Buddhist model of the mind. Well, I say quite simple. In some ways, the model of the mind is quite simple, but it also has a kind of complexity to it and a subtlety to it. I'm going to begin by kind of going in fairly gently, I hope, and just talking about the kind of basic Buddhist model of how the mind works, and then perhaps move on to some of the subtleties and complexities as we progress. Because I'm an academic, I have to do this kind of thing first. Just to start, the Buddhist models of the mind that I'm going to talk about, basically, well, there are three schools of Indian Buddhist systematic thought, basically, each giving a slightly different model of the mind, the Sarvastivada, the Yogacara, and the Theravada. They formulated their systems around the 4th to 5th centuries of the Christian era. That's where they were kind of crystallized mostly. It doesn't mean that nothing happened after that, but the core of their thought is established at that kind of period. I'm going to talk mostly about the Theravada model. A lot of what I will say would be common to the other models. Though there are some specific details and things where there are differences. So, I want to start with some very basic principles of Buddhist psychology. What does it mean to be conscious from the point of view of Buddhist psychology? And the answer is basically to be conscious is to be conscious of something. So the model of the mind is essentially this intentional model of the mind. If you're conscious, you are conscious of an object. And object is a technical term in this respect, aramana. An object can take various types. And this is, I've put up here just one kind of classification of the types of objects you can have. So we can say that objects basically fall into three broad categories. So you can be aware or conscious of something through one of the five senses. So through the sense of the eye, you are aware of colors. You can be conscious of sounds. So sounds can be an object's tastes, smells, and tangible bodily sensations. You can also be conscious, according to this model, of states of mind. So I can be aware of my own anger, or my own fear, or my own friendliness or compassion. I can take as an object my own mental states. You can also have as objects concepts, and in fact probably in our waking life most of the time we have a lot of these concepts flying around. So concepts are everything else apart from colour, sound, smells, tastes and mental states. Everything else that you're aware of is a concept, according to this model, falls into that category. So table, tree, man, woman, Rupert, Max, these are all examples of concepts. So that's the basic idea. You're conscious of an object. How does consciousness arise, according to this model? Well, consciousness consists in the arising and ceasing of discrete minds. So as you are aware, a particular mind arises for a moment and then ceases. And each of these moments of mind has an object of the type that I have just been talking about. And sometimes that object may be the same as the previous mind. So these minds arise and cease, and they're very, very short-lived. They last for a mere moment, and a moment is a mere moment, very, very short time. But they arise very rapidly, one after another, contiguously, continuously. they arise, and this gives the illusion of a kind of flow, an even flow of consciousness. Exactly like the way when we watch a movie film, we're not aware of frames, we see movement. But in some sense, according to this model, your consciousness is flashing on and off all the time, but so rapidly that it's not something that you particularly are aware of on a moment-to-moment basis. So each discrete moment of consciousness occurs, though, as a bundle of mind, so there's the bare awareness of the object, but associated with that mind are various other mental functions called cetasikas. And all these mental functions are directed towards the object that you are aware of. I'll say a little bit more about these objects, these mental functions that accompany consciousness, accompany each moment of consciousness in a moment. But we should be, according to the model, the mental functions, of course, arise and cease at exactly the same time as consciousness itself. So the arising and ceasing of these mental functions is a unified thing. They all arise as a bundle and cease as a bundle, these consciousness and its consciousness factors or mental functions. So Buddhist psychology tried to provide a kind of list, a full taxonomy of mental functions that arose or that arise with consciousness at each moment. And the Sarvastivadin list gives us 46, the Yogacara 51, and the Theravada 52. On the next slide, just as by way of example, this is the list of Theravadin mental functions. So this list of 52 basically is meant to cover everything your mind can do. There is nothing that is left out. Now, obviously, if you look at it, you might say, well, where are certain things? Well, the argument would be they fall under one of these categories. So they're quite broad things. So if we give you a little example to get some sort of sense of them, I mean, some of them are clearer than others. So, I mean, at the top you have something like contact, feeling, labeling, will, one-pointedness. Well, we can talk about what those mean, and they have technical definitions. Commitment, vigor, joy, desire to act, delusion, these are the bad ones, the unskillful ones, delusion, shamelessness, recklessness, restlessness, greed, fixed view, conceit, envy, aversion. So take, for example, aversion would include anger, mild irritation, a range of phenomena that would all fall under that category. So they're fairly broad in the way they're conceived. So that's just to give you some example of the sorts of things that are covered by them. What is important, though, in this model is to realize that there's no such thing as basic, bare awareness of an object. You cannot just be conscious of an object. That is, whenever consciousness arises, according to this model, it is associated with other mental functions. So all instances of consciousness, according to this model, have additional functions happening. What are the minimal functions? Well, again, the different schools give slightly different lists. So according to the Sarvastivada, there were 10 basic mental functions that always arise at every moment of consciousness. The Yogacara says just 5, the Theravadins give 7. Those different lists have a common core. And I'm going to just highlight those 5 of those which are a common core. So it says whenever you are conscious, you have contact in some way with an object. What contact means is it's one of the more difficult ones to be absolutely clear about what is meant here. There is some kind of turning towards the object. You pay attention to the object in some way. You have a feeling about the object. You like the object, you dislike the object, or there's a neutrality. But it's important to understand that neutrality here is not the absence of a feeling, it's another kind of feeling about the object. You label the object in some way, you classify it in some way, and the mind is somehow willfully directing itself towards that object. Now, some of these are a little bit, as I say, subtle, maybe not clear, but I think the two that interest me and I think are particularly important are these, feeling and labeling. This, according to this model then, at every moment, you can't be aware of an object without, in some sense, having a feeling about it. So consciousness is intrinsically affective. There's no such thing as bare cognitive consciousness according to this model of the mind. Also, consciousness has to, at some level, put a mark on what it's a basic function of the mind, so you can't be aware of an object without marking it. What's interesting about this is, though, that at some level, of course, what it's saying is that we do this whether we want to do it or not. You can't not do it. And it happens at all moments. And this is where perhaps one might, according to this, at least all these systems of Buddhist thought, I mean, Buddhas do this. And they will do it even at the moment they're enlightened and always after they're enlightened. So the point is that feeling and this labeling, if I call it that, is an intrinsic part of consciousness. Okay, I'm now going to move on to talk about the consciousness process. According to this model of the mind, we can say that there are three basic different modes of consciousness. So there's your mind, consciousness in deep dreamless sleep. And this is a kind of consciousness. You may not remember it, you may not be aware of it when you're in it, but according to this model, it is a type of consciousness. Alan already touched on some of the things that are mentioned about this type of consciousness, and there are different discussions in Buddhist schools. I mean, it has this technical term sometimes, bhavanga, which can be translated as existence continuum. Not that that means anything very much, so perhaps one should just stay with bhavanga, though I've used existence continuum at some points in this presentation for it. Sometimes it's referred to as the alaya vijnana, something like that. But in this system that I'm talking about, we'll stick with this idea of bhavanga. So it's a base state of consciousness that you return to when you're not doing anything, or when your mind is not doing anything. You slip into this. And it's what you slip into in deep dreamless sleep. At other times, well, when you're awake, you are processing objects all the time. And also you do this when you're dreaming. So the dreaming state is more like the waking state than it is like the deep dreamless state in this model. Then there's a third mode, meditation. By meditation here, I mean when you attain a specific attainment, like Samadhi, then again the mind rests in some way undisturbed by lots and lots of different objects. So I've just illustrated this. You don't find this quite in Buddhist texts, but I think it's a reasonable graphic representation or interpretation of what they're saying. And I'm going to elaborate on this. But so in the middle, this is our mind in a waking state. We come in and out of bhavanga all the time, out of this base state. We're going up, in and out of it, processing objects. That's what you are doing now, I hope. I'm just checking to see if there's anyone in deep dreamless sleep. If you were in deep dreamless sleep, there would be nothing happening. You would be just in this sort of state, right? The consciousness is still. The moment is just, the type of mind is repeating itself. If you were in Samadhi, you would be, as it were, at the top of the wave rather than at the base of the wave. And again, nothing would be happening. No objects would be coming into the mind, apart from the object of concentration at that point. Okay, so I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. So what the next slide represents is one bump, as it were, in this state. So this is the details of it. So you start, here's your base state of mind, which you return to in deep dreamless sleep, but which occurs between each moment you process an object. So an object, and this model diagram describes what happens when you become aware of a sense object. So a sense object has to kind of impinge on the mind in some way. It kind of knocks on the door of the mind. And they use this metaphor of knock. So it knocks on the door, and your mind is disturbed. It does a little wobble. And then it turns to the door and opens the door. So this is adverting, and this is a kind of consciousness, a particular function of consciousness. You then are aware of the object. You receive, basically there's just the consciousness of the object. There's then receiving it, you take it in, you examine it a little bit, investigate it, and then you make a decision about it. You determine it, what kind of object it is, and then you do something with the object. And this is Jhāna, or impulsion. Then this is the sort of after experience, it's called retention. You hold on to the object for a moment, 2 moments, boom, and you're that again. And then this process goes on and on and on. So this is what, according to this model, is going on in your minds at this moment, in some way or another. Now, I'm going to just say a little now about these different stages. So each of these stages is a type of consciousness. But what we have is basically a movement from this, I'll leave out the existence continuum, but a movement when your mind begins to wake up from adverting to impulsion. You have basically a movement from very simple, basic types of consciousness and awareness to more complex types of consciousness. That is, at the bottom level, when you just advert, there are just the consciousness and the basic functions of the mind, not much else. So you have the 5 I mentioned previously: contact, feeling, labeling, paying attention. I can't remember that, but I've got one. There you are. So you have those kind of 5, willfully directing, right, at this stage. But you then add something. When you advert to the object, you have the 7 basic functions, plus you have 3 more. A function called thinking of and examining the object, and also making a decision about it. Because when the point is that the mind is adverting to something, and it's got to actually pay attention to it now. And it's made a decision that it's going to pay attention to this particular object. So that's why these extra functions begin to come in. At the moment you perceive the mind, this is the simplest kind of mind, sorry, the moment you perceive the object, this is the simplest kind of object there is. There is just these bare awareness plus the 7 basic functions, but remember they include feeling and this labeling. You then investigate and receive, investigate and determine. So there's still this thinking about the object, examining it, and this decision. The mind has made a decision, it's examining this object. It's kind of beginning to speed up though at this stage. You also have this extra thing, energy, vigor. So the mind's putting something into this now. And then you get to the final stage, impulsion. And this is when you really do something with the object, you use the object. And here you can have up to maybe 27 additional mental functions, all occurring at once. What happens at that stage? Well, there are basically 4 possibilities at that stage. You've got this object. You are either, it might be an object that you like, and the danger is that if it's an object that you like, the mind wants it to go on. So greed arises, attachment arises. You want this object to stay with you. You grab hold of it. It could be an object that you don't like. And if it's an object that you don't like, the danger is that you push it away. You want it to stop get out of my mind. It could be an object that you are not sure about, and you can have some doubt. So you sit there, I'm not sure, hesitant. So you make this decision. So this is, in Buddhist terms, it's reaction. I mean, it's your will. This is where you create good and bad karma. So the first three possibilities are all really they're the unskillful options, the unwholesome. This is where you create bad karma. The fourth possibility is that actually, with regard to the object, a kind of balanced state arises, where instead of there being greed or hatred, which are mutually exclusive, instead of holding on to the object or pushing it away, you see the object evenly and in a balanced way. And at that point, there has to be a kind of non-attachment and even friendliness and non-aversion towards the object. So and this is the skillful mind, this fourth possibility. This is where you create good karma. The other three are, in effect, creating bad karma from this point of view. So what's interesting about this is that the unskillful mind is intrinsically unbalanced. It's either pushing the object away, or it's holding on to it. Or it's sort of in this restless, uneasy state where it doesn't know what to do. The skillful, wholesome mind is inherently considered as somehow holding those tendencies of the mind to push away or hold on, as holding them together in a kind of balanced, even view of the object. And this is what you try to train your mind to do in Buddhist practice, basically, to do this rather than that. Of course, this process is happening so fast that you can't stop it doing this. You can't just say, oh, I'm not going to do this anymore. It's a process of training, and this is basically what I suppose all Buddhist practice is, not just Buddhist meditation practice, but all types of Buddhist practice are geared to trying to create conditions whereby this happens when you bring in an object rather than one of the first three possibilities. So in meditation practice, the idea is that you work on increasing or strengthening particular mental factors that accompany types of consciousness. And there are some that we hear a lot of, that are talked about a lot. Obviously mindfulness these days. Two others, though, that I think are particularly interesting in this particular context, in the context of meditation, which I think are not talked about enough as things that are distinguished by the Buddhist psychological taxonomy, if you like. And these are two things called, I've translated as thinking of and examining, vitakka and vichara, or Sanskrit vitarka. So vitarka and vichara. So these are dual functions of the mind. So basically they're saying that vitarka is what lifts the mind onto the object. It's actively pushing the mind onto the object. And vichara is staying with the object and examining it. And I'm doing this with my hands because I'm thinking of a particular simile in the text, which says that vitarka is like taking hold of a pot, and vichara is like rubbing it. And they give a lot of other similes. But basically what they're saying you have to do in meditation is, you see, normally you put the mind onto an object and then you fall off again. And we may examine it a little bit. But when we get interested in something, this doesn't happen just in meditation, we put the mind onto the object and we keep putting it on there and we really examine it. Of course, there are all sorts of things where these two functions work. In fact, it's saying you cannot think without these functions. So you use them when you're thinking intellectually, when you get absorbed in reading a book or whatever. Whenever you're thinking about anything, these two functions become particularly important. The other one-pointedness. This is a word for concentration, if you like. And when you develop concentration or one-pointedness, then the mind stays on the object. And then the other important thing in the context of meditation here, which the model makes a lot of, is feeling, the feeling that goes along here. What happens to the feeling during meditation, happiness and joy. And the basic theory is something like this. This goes over a little bit what I've already been talking about. I mean, I'm going to go with a very simple definition of mindfulness here, which I think is probably in many ways more in tune with the basic definition that is used in this model. So mindfulness is remembering, in a sense, when you're doing your meditation, to do your meditation, rather than think about something else. So it's what keeps you doing whatever it is you should be doing, that you've decided that you have been doing. Then this vitakka and vichara. I mean, the problem is that even if you remember what it is you should be doing, you're doing mindfulness of breathing or something, but every time you put your mind onto your object, it sort of falls off again, and you have to do it again, you have to do it again. Now, what this model says of meditation is that if you do it enough, if you keep putting your mind back onto the object and examining the object enough, again and again and again and again and again and again and again, eventually, the mind will stay on the object. It will become fixed and locked on the object. And there's a term for this. This is appana in Pāli, a fixing of the mind on the object. It doesn't fall off and look for another object. And at that point, the model says that what happens is an extraordinary, and the word extraordinary is deliberate here, a kind of joy and happiness arises that is quite different from, it's of a different order of the joy and happiness that we normally experience. The mind suddenly becomes content with this object, and spontaneously, as it were, a kind of joy and happiness comes into that moment. And this is the transformation where the one-pointedness, where you're just staying with an object for a moment, happens, and what we call Samadhi happens, Jhāna, these different terms are used. So there's a kind of interesting, I think, it's a simple but nevertheless almost kind of counterintuitive claim made here. I mean, because normally, the mind is rushing around looking for all sorts of different objects because it wants something new to make it happy. And we think by rushing around looking for new objects and more exciting objects and whatever, we'll eventually find the object that we want and that will actually make us happy. What's being suggested here is that actually the way to make the mind happy is to precisely stop that process. And that if you stop the process of the mind running around looking for more exciting and interesting objects, it will actually become happy if it's just still and rests with one object. But it does have to be a simple object, because if an object is too complicated, the mind starts wiseacring too much. So you have to choose carefully simple objects. So what happens? This is back to this kind of model here. So this is this existence continuum, this bhavanga, this state of mind when you're in deep dreamless sleep or in between every moment of consciousness. So most of our meditation practice, according to this model, would be not so different from our ordinary waking state. The mind is going up and down, trying different ways and whatever. It may be getting insights and so forth, but it is basically going up and down. But it is possible, by following looking at it this model, but basically what happens eventually is that you advert to an object, and I've left out a complication. I was talking earlier about the sense store process, where you process an object that's coming into the mind from outside. This particular diagram shows what happens when you are contemplating something that is not coming into the mind from outside, but is an internal object, a concept, the object of meditation. And you advert to the mind door, you begin to do something with it, but the mind suddenly sticks on the object and you enter Samadhi. And this can go on for a long, long time. So that's what the dash is there. So the cycle of going up and down is broken. So this is back to the model I had at the beginning, that there are two places where the cycle is broken. One in deep dreamless sleep, and one in this more extraordinary altered state, Samadhi, where the mind stays at this particular level. I suppose what's interesting in a way about the model is that in this state we are asleep. We characteristically don't remember what it's like to be in deep dreamless sleep. We may have some kind of sense. Obviously, when we wake up, we perhaps do have a sense of a night where we've slept well. What do we mean by that? Probably we mean a lot of that. But the interesting thing about this is that it's the opposite end of the spectrum, the Samadhi spectrum. So it's a kind of hyper awakeness rather than just, but the mind is similarly, as in dreamless sleep, just as when you're in deep dreamless sleep, someone can make a noise, someone can even shake you in the bed, and you might not wake up at all. You're oblivious to what is going on outside. The mind has, as it were, is not paying attention to the sense doors. So in Samadhi as well, the mind is not choosing to pay attention to the sense doors. So that's, whoops, I'll keep that up there. That's basically the model I want to present. There are various things that I've glossed over in details, but I think I will stop there, as I've been talking for just a little bit over half an hour, I think, and invite questions, comments, and maybe I can elaborate things if necessary. Shall I?
Yeah.
So Alan was first in, but
I'd love a point of clarification here.
Yeah.
With regard to this last point about Samadhi, as you know, there's a lot of popular literature about jhanas and coming out of jhanas and so forth. I would like your clarification as a real expert in this area. When you're immersed in jhana, even access to Upachara Samadhi, access to the first jhana, for example, my understanding, and I'm ready to be corrected immediately, is when you slip into that access that your mind is dissolved into Bhavanga. When you go into full jhana, then you're still in deep state of Samadhi, but my understanding is the attention is totally withdrawn from the sense fields. In both the Upachara Samadhi, the access to the first jhana, as well as the full jhana, as well as second, third, and fourth, let alone the formless realms. My understanding is that one is really, in all of these states, disengaged from the sense fields, whereas quite a number of people disagree. And so what is your clarification? And the parallel question is that my understanding of Buddhist practice is you refine the attention with your practice of samatha, achieving jhana, and then you take that superbly refined mind with the joy, the happiness, the single-pointedness, and so forth, and you apply that in satipatthana. You apply that in the close examination and investigation of body, feelings, mental states, and phenomena. But then how can you apply samadhi if you're totally disengaged from all the senses? How can you apply that to the body and so forth simultaneously? So I really don't know, and I'd love to get insight from you.
Well, I think the problem with some of the discussions is that there is basically in the text a theoretical model. Sometimes I don't think the theoretical model is studied or read closely enough. Yeah. And then, of course, with these things, people have thousands of opinions and say, oh yes, but according, in my experience or whatever. The model is, I think, very clear that in Samadhi, right, so the mind is not paying attention to any other object. It's become fixed on the object of Samadhi. So you would not be aware of noises in the room or for that time. Just as when you're in deep dreamless sleep, you're not aware of those things. It's a parallel in that sense state. The question of access is a little bit more complicated. I'm not quite sure that... access is... in some sense, you understood as sort of on the, it's sometimes called, you're on the threshold, you're half in, you've got 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And how you actually understand that in terms of the model is, it's sort of, I think, and I'd have to check that, it's a kind of that you're momentarily, well, not quite momentarily, but you're the idea is that if you go into Samadhi, you could be there. You could be there for actually quite a short time. It would still be Samadhi. It may only be a few seconds, as it were, a few moments of Samadhi, but you could be there for hours, according to the tradition. There's no, the kind of limits they put on it are sort of mythic in a sense. They're 7 days or something like that. So access is sort of perhaps going in and out in some kind of way. You're on the threshold. In terms of applying what you said, applying the mind, it seems to me that it's fairly simple that once the mind has been really established in Samadhi, when you come out of Samadhi and you apply that mind to the things you normally think of, you see them with a kind of clarity and vividness that you don't normally have, because something of the hyper awakeness, alertness, awareness remains with you for some time. So you, as I understand it, the model is that you don't do insight meditation, if you like, in Samadhi. You can't do insight meditation in Samadhi because the mind is locked on one object. You only do insight meditation. So insight meditation is more like ordinary waking meditation, or ordinary waking consciousness, according to this model. But of course you're doing it with a kind of mind at the stage of, if I go back to my model, at the stage of impulsion here, you're going to have an exclusively skillful, wholesome mind because you've just come out of Samadhi. You're not so likely to be suddenly be thrown by an object and feel greed for it or feel hate towards it or something like that. That's what I think is.
Very good. Thank you.
Understood.
Thank you. Very helpful.
I think you... Sorry,
yeah.
Jim. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this makes much sense, but as I was, the beginning of this whole notion is this instant creation and dissolution of the universe, of every moment, or tiny, tiny moments.
Mm-hmm.
And if I eliminate that possibility and simply say that mind states rise and mind states dissolve, but not with this kind of flash, the rest of it makes the same sense to me.
Mm.
And I'm not sure where there is a fundamental either objectivity or personal experience, or where there's not proof. I don't want to get into that materialistic world. But how do we come to the conclusion that there is a need for this flash effect to be a central way of looking at the mind? When personal experience, it's very hard to see that as you pointed out, the mind actually doesn't see that. It sees it the way we see a film. We don't see the frames.
Well, I think these models are, to some extent, based, they arise out of a kind of reflection, so there's a certain reason logic reflecting on experience here, and there's this experience. Now, it's manifest that sometimes the mind computes, if I use that analogy or metaphor, as we tend to these days, everything, we use computer metaphors for everything. But the mind processes an awful lot of experiences in a flat, and we're aware that in less than a second, somehow we have made all sorts of calculations. So I think that's one thing that is explained. The other point is that it's trying to break down exactly, when does your anger change to compassion? When do feelings change? Once we've accepted that the mind is changing, I mean, why we have to divide it up. I mean, clearly my state of mind is different at one time from another time, and clearly it can change quite fast. So, why should... I think the logic is really that these processes of change there's a kind of constant thing going on below the threshold of our awareness. And this is, again, I suppose there are two things going on here. I mean, one is the surface that we're aware of, and the other is what is sort of happening. And a lot of these processes are happening kind of below the threshold. And so it's to kind of accommodate that sort of sense that actually, in ordinary conscious awareness, we're only aware of the surface, I think, and there's something of that. And it's just this logical problem of, change. Well, if you say that things change, and last for a while, well, if you analyze it down, in the end you get to a sort of a point instant of time, really. Right.
Within conventional psychology of consciousness, it's quite standard to think of moments of consciousness of roughly 200 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds perhaps, depending on which kind of calculation you do. So it's not an unstandard thing to say within conventional cognitive psychology of perception, shall we say, and the way memory works and in combination with perception. So it's just, I just got...
I'm trying to roughly go in order of... I think you had...
If you could just develop something you started mentioning as an answer to Alan. If we go to reflexive consciousness in both dreamless sleep and dream sleep, and you have lucid dream or witnessing sleep, if I understand you well, what you're saying is that at that point, according to Buddhist psychology, you would be more at the impulsion level. You are not as bound to be just taken by the changes in your mind. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, basically there is the mode of mind where the mind is processing objects. Mm-hmm. And these objects can be coming from outside through the senses, but they can also be objects, memories. Most of those objects, mind objects, are often concepts. So when we have a memory, it's a concept. We have, So we're processing all the time conceptual objects in our minds, and that's basically what we're doing in dreaming. Of course, what they would say, a dream might, be triggered by you might hear a sound and it does get incorporated in your dream, but in your dream it becomes something else.
But making it lucid, then, I'm just trying to see what distinction they make between lucid dreams and regular dreams,
right,
and lucid dreamless sleep. and reflective dreamless sleep witnessing? Do they?
Well, in this particular model, there is no particular account. There are accounts of different causes of dreams, but precisely a lucid dream here in this particular model, and those kinds of distinctions are not formally talked about in the models that I'm talking about.
If I could pitch in there, it is a fascinating area, and lucid dreams, I think it doesn't come up in the Pāli canon of recognizing the dream as a dream, or in the Theravada, I've never seen it. It's very explicit, as you probably know, in dream yoga, in the Tibetan tradition, but it's clearly Jhāna. Jhāna is also the impulsion, right? The activities of the mind. So whether the dream is non-lucid, you don't know you're dreaming, or lucid, either way it's the same, in the sense of being Jhāna. But where it gets to be a very interesting anomaly, and I'd love to see some Theravada scholar address this, because I've never seen it done, is when you are indeed in deep dreamless sleep, your mind is resting then in the bhavanga, which I call the ground of becoming, because the anga can also mean ground or basis. Ground of becoming, bhava rather than existence, but becoming. But that's nitpicking. But there you are in deep dreamless sleep, but you know it. You know you're in deep dreamless sleep. So now it's an anomaly, isn't it?
Well, I mean, there are discussions about whether you can be aware or you can lucidly attain bhavanga. I mean, to be fair, the texts are not that interested in bhavanga in this context, because bhavanga is regarded as, I mean, to get into, it's the state of mind, it's a reflection of the state of mind you were in just before you died in your previous life. That's what bhavanga is. It's a carryover. It's sort of who you are. It's your base consciousness. It's what you return to in between each moment. You do something new. But it's kind of what you did. It's the past. It is influencing the present, but you can't do much with it. There's no point in, I mean, it's good, you need to spend some time each day in bhavanga, in deep dreamless sleep, but it's not a state that is considered in this tradition particularly useful for developing things in that way. So it has a different sort of function. I have no idea who, but
just two or three lots of questions actually. In one of the first models that you gave, you made reference, I can't remember the exact wording, but willful movement. Willful. Isn't it the case though that much of the world which impacts upon us has such an impact, but there is no actual willfulness on our part to be exposed to that kind of contact?
Yeah. I mean, this is a subtle point in. I'm trying to.
Willfully, number 5.
Yeah, psychology. I suppose what's going on here. It's in this. This is said to occur in some kind of way in every type of consciousness. I will confess, I mean, in terms of actually trying to understand what is being said here, I'm not certain. I mean, there are two ways of reading it. One is a traditional sort of, I mean, this is the word in Pāli, in Sanskrit, Chaitana. And why is it in every type of consciousness? Because they admit that it has, because Chaitana is really the, what willful, intentional action, which comes into, I've lost my diagrams, but it comes into, it really only comes into its own here. So they are saying that it's also here in some kind of way, but it's a sort of, again, a sort of passive reflection of something. It's not active will. I know that's slightly contradictory, but that's what seems to be being said. It's a sort of imprint of previous will that has left a sort of mark. Yeah. And therefore, I think the model is precisely saying, yes, that the question of choosing which objects to attend to is a subtle one. I mean, there is obviously when we're doing particular meditation practices, or, we can decide to pay attention to an object, and that's clearly very willful. But there are obviously, there's a kind of will that's sometimes going on that we're not aware of, which I think is also kind of interesting, isn't it? This sort of, we do choose, we have habits, and we set up imprints and things in our minds, and we almost, the whole question of choice and free will in this is extremely complex and interesting because it's a causally connected condition sequence, which nevertheless wants to say that it's not predetermined. There are moments, there's space for changing the way it's going to happen. So it's not. And so I think there's this complex interaction between past will and habits that you've set up and so forth embedded in here. I don't know whether that...
Can I squeeze my second question? Sure, okay. You gave the list, of course, an important one of some of the problems of the mind, the desire, the attraction, the aversion, the delusion. Then you made reference to the positive one of which was balance. Couldn't balance, even though there may be the absence of greed and aversion, couldn't balance be a delusion of the mind, because there could be the absence of problematic mind, but what really is needed is some very clear and direct action, and balance could be an avoidance of action.
Well, I think that's true. I think, trying to remember which way to go here. I think I'll go here, this way, yeah. Well, I think the problem with balance is this. The balance is distinguished as...
Is there a Pāli word instead?
Well, tatra majjhatthā, which is basically upekkha, but its base term is tatra majjhatthā. I think the problem is, in the unskillful mind, you can either, there's greed, you're attached, or there's pushing away. There's also this kind of sitting in the middle. And I think the danger is that can actually sometimes look like balance. But it's actually, according to this analysis, it's actually a restless, slightly uneasy state, which can include this incapacitating sort of doubt. But there's this uddhacca there. It's a sort of balance because the mind doesn't know what to do, but it's not real balance. Because real balance has to be, it's not a useful balance, if you like. Real balance, according to the model, has to be you can't have it unless you also have all these things. It's somehow, but it's the key to drawing all the different tendencies of the mind together. So balance is understood, yes, as a, well, as I just said, I think it allows what otherwise might unbalance the mind to exist in a kind of harmony, if you like, and therefore you can act effectively. Whereas the other kind of balance is sitting in the middle. You don't know how to act. It precisely stops you, incapacitates you in some way.
You're referring to the near enemy of upekkha.
Yes.
Stupid indifference.
Indifference, because balance is not the same as indifference, exactly. I don't know who. I think you had your hand up for a long time. I've noticed you, my peripheral vision. I know this kind of.
My understanding of Buddhism is worse than minimal, but when you're explaining the various concepts, I felt extremely comfortable because it seemed to me that they were almost exactly the same as, or at least translatable into Patanjali's language.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't seem to be as surprising because there are books written by people who say that basically the origin of, because Patanjali's writing came much later, Buddhist writing came earlier, so some people have claimed to the extent that Patanjali is basically translating Buddhism. So that doesn't seem to be most, in spite of that overlap, the Advaitins and Buddhists seem to be at daggers drawn for a long time.
Sometimes, yeah.
And regardless of that, the language of the states, going back to Mandukya Upanishad, for instance, and all the way down to Shankaracharya and later, seems just not that different at all.
The language of the states,
not
you mean?
much different, especially in terms of the states of Samadhi.
Like,
Not so much states of Samadhi as the Nidra and,
Yeah, the waking, sleep,
states.
this kind of thing, yeah.
Seems to be just exactly
This
the
is-
same.
yeah.
That doesn't seem to be. What most interesting for me is when you pointed out that the feeling component is always almost there.
Mm.
It's not purely belief, it's not purely emotion, it's not purely volition, but all of these. That seemed to be the translation of the Vedantic notion of jnata karta bhokta. Simultaneously, the person is someone who thinks, feels, and does things. And more specifically, I see a reflection of the same in Locke. From Stanford, Mr. Hilgard has a paper on the trilogy of mind. And that has continued all the way from Locke down to Alexander, down to even contemporary times. It continues to be the same. Attitude was defined as having three components, and that was a big thing in social psychology for a long time. What I'm saying is that, is there that kind of give and take, or whether it is commonality in thinking about the human nature in pre-biblical terms?
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
I'm intrigued.
Yes, no, it is an intriguing question. To go back to the first part of what you were saying, Patanjali and Buddhism. I think my own sort of feeling about this, and there's a sort of, various arguments. Sometimes people want to have the model that Buddhism borrowed from non-Buddhist yoga, or then the argument that Buddhism basically influenced Patanjali, and sometimes people get very worked up about these kinds of who was first. I suspect no one was first, in the sense that I suspect there was a more fluid interest in the practice of these Samadhi types of exercise and exchange of ideas, and that people didn't always worry about, they read what each other, or talked to each other, I should say, not read, but talked to each other about these things, and exchanged ideas. So, we do have a lot of common language, especially in the Yoga Sutras about this. And as you say already in the Upanishads, you have this basic scheme of the waking state, dream, deep dream, and you have this kind of thing. Of course, the dating of those Upanishads is sometimes again argued about. But I've always found that kind of quite remarkable, the way these early Indian texts do talk about, distinguish this deep dream and sleep state. I don't know when that's first distinguished in Western psychology.
To say that Locke was basically borrowing something, it doesn't make quite a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Maybe, may not be. And it doesn't, to me, which came first doesn't make a very interesting question.
Yeah.
But the commonality still is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And we are here talking about east, west, and give and take.
Yes.
And that seems to be quite a common point of conversion.
So the three things that you see as common are cognition, feeling,
and volition.
Yeah.
They are almost exactly parallel.
Yeah, I suppose the interesting thing is the one about volition is in terms of the discussion we were just having earlier. There is although schematically or in some way volition is put as in every type of consciousness, it has this very attenuated role in certain types of consciousness, according to the Buddhist thing. It's not really quite what we think of as volition. There's this complication, which is but yeah, okay. Max,
My question really has to do with the relationship between the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. And what triggered my wanting to ask you about it was almost seemed like an off-the-cuff comment when you were talking about the Bhavanga. And you said something like, well, the Bhavanga is what you have been. And it's not really of all that much interest because, you know, you're more concerned with what will be and what you can do about it. And my question to you, and the reason I wanted to ask about this is because my understanding also is that in terms of defining who you are, in terms of what continues, in terms of the previous discussion we had with Alan, Buddhist thought anyway, it's the Bhavanga which defines continuity. So my question to you is, Bhavanga in these situations isn't of all that much interest to you, and who are you?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I shouldn't have put it that it's... I think Bhavanga is of interest. It's not a state that you particularly cultivate, as it were. But it is who you are in some kind of way, and of course it's understood as influencing you all the time because you keep...
But who's the you?
Well, that is, yeah, right, okay. Well, according to what you are an interaction between your past, who you've been, and who you are now. I mean, you are precisely that process. You are precisely that process of it. You're in dialogue, or perhaps to put it better, you are the dialogue between the present and the past. But it's a dialogue. I mean, and I suppose that's the intrinsic thing about this model, that you are not a static thing. And this goes back to the question. You are not static. You are an evolving process. But that evolving process is not free of the past. It is interacting with the past in every moment, almost literally. So, but you are making the future in the present, in dialogue, in reaction, influenced by the past, and you are that process.
And I think that is starting to kind of address the question. I suppose, just putting it another way, who decides? Right.
Well, yeah. That is the big question. And the answer is, of course, no one decides, but a decision is made in Buddhist, traditional kind of Buddhist terms. Because there's the basic model, of course, is that there's a bundle of conditions that arises in this moment, which conditions the bundle of conditions that arises in the next moment, which conditions the bundle of conditions, and that's what you are. Somewhere in that, there is the possibility of the way the bundle of conditions evolves being directed. But you can't locate the you that's doing the decision in any one place. That is what is being suggested, that you can't sort of say there's one place where the decision is being made and there's a person deciding and controlling it. I'll go forward. In terms of the process, it's often said that it happens here. Once you've started doing something with the object of the mind, it's too late to change anything. So this is the sort of point where you check. This is because this is the past. So this is just the result of previous karma. This all is happening as the result of previous karma. This little bit adverting here and determining are neither the result of previous karma, nor are they new karma. They're called kriya in the technical term. They're just merely doing of the mind. And they're crucial. That's where the decisions happen, but it's not someone making the decisions, but that's how it happens according to the model. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, my point is sort of connected with Anand's and Etzel's, in that I was also seeing the similarity with the different states as mentioned in the Yoga Sutras and also in Kashmiri Shaivism. But what I think maybe brings to bear on Etzel's point is that what they say in Kashmiri Shaivism is that in meditation we become aware of conscious thinking, yes, rather than just unconsciously being at it, we bring awareness to bear to it. Then as we develop our meditation, we learn to become aware at the level of the dream mind. And they say that the nighttime of the layperson is the daytime of the yogi. And as our meditation deepens and we become more skillful, we learn to become aware at the deep, dreamless level of consciousness. And this takes us into what they call turiya, which is the fourth state of consciousness, which is not where we're cut off from everything in the stillness, but we're in the stillness and we are completely aware. And this is more like the Dzogchen.
That's right.
And I find it very interesting in talking with the people at Sami Ling who are into the Kagyu Tibetan tradition, and they consider that the Kagyu Tibetan tradition has many, many links with Kashmiri Shaivism, which is this bringing to bear of this aspect of consciousness, which is I'm calling awareness, but which various different names are given to. And it's bringing that to bear on these different stages that you mentioned that is the key to enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, the link between Kashmiri Shaivism and Tibetan Buddhism is very clear, I mean, historically. But I suppose, I mean, in a way, what I was talking about is that, I mean, at some level, as soon as we start talking about Samadhi, there's a way in which we're talking about something advanced and beyond the basic. But I was trying to focus on the basic models, if you like. I mean, Samadhi, I think as Alan touched on in his first question to me, I mean, is of all sorts of different levels. And then there's what you do when you come out of Samadhi. I mean, within the model of meditation as a whole, I mean, there are all sorts of, Samadhi is a preparation, it's a kind of training, it's a kind of application. So there are these 4 levels of Samadhi traditionally in Buddhism, and then there are all these different things that you do with Samadhi, like remember your past lives and fly through the air, walk on water, and whatever. You can do all that with Samadhi. And you can become enlightened with Samadhi. So Samadhi has all these applications. So, but I find, I suppose, just it interesting and worthwhile, this kind of clarity in the model about thinking about this contrast between a state of mind where the mind is still in deep dreamless sleep and not paying attention to the object, and a state of mind called Samadhi where the mind becomes fixed on an object but is awake. I don't know, I suppose I find that interesting because it's actually a fairly basic model, free of a lot of doctrinal or it doesn't say anything about what the nature of reality is really like. And I find that quite useful to focus on, just in terms of being clear about what a Buddhist model of the mind might look like, or is when one's sort of thinking about and trying to make parallels. Because once you start talking about the really high states of meditation in different traditions, you then get people sort of, well, they either say, well, it's all the same, and people, but it gets quite sectarian sometimes, and I find that sometimes a little bit problematic. Yeah, okay.
I've got a sort of a question,
Mm.
a timid of expressing it, coming from a totally different training, which is Jungian.
Mm.
But I'm just wondering, is there in this Buddhist tradition the idea that all the experiences for thousands and thousands or millions of years are in a kind of matrix of deeper consciousness, and that one's own work in this way that you've described has any impact on that huge collective inherited mass of experience? I don't know how to put it in any other way. Because if there is, I mean, is there a conscious position where you can choose to interact with this deeper dimension and actually have an effect on it? Or do you have no effect whatsoever, no matter what you do?
No effect on
the general, I don't know, this mass of consciousness.
Collective and conscious.
Yeah.
Yes, cosmic consciousness, you're right.
I mean, if I speak, I mean, at the moment I'm just trying to speak in a way that is true to the tradition, right? I don't think it talks precisely in those terms. That's not to say that if I thought about it a bit more, I couldn't find some things there that might make links. But it doesn't particularly choose to speak in that kind of idiom. I mean, I think you would have to go into the realm of, what it is to be a Buddha, if you want to talk about having an effect on the whole cosmos. Yeah.
There is a branch of Buddhism that moved to China
Mm.
and has a very long name, which is in my book, which I can't remember, begins with an A, which speaks about this extraordinary, it's a huge book, speaks about this great mass of cosmic, an entity, if you like, of which we're all part.
Yeah, I mean, East Asian Buddhism tended. I mean, there are developments in Buddhism where you do talk about more of a kind of big mind in some way, and this became particularly important in East Asia. There are the seeds of that in some schools of Indian Buddhism, but in the systematic Buddhist thought that I'm talking about specifically, it's not so explicit.
On a totally different context, if you like, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, there are some concepts where, as I say, you can if you follow the route of asking what it is to be a Buddha. I mean, if you go into Yogacara and ask what it is to be a Buddha and what the Dhammakaya is precisely, then you may be getting into an area where you could make crossovers.
Just a footnote to that. I think there is something more basic, though, and not without going into one particular school. Just the notion that karma is not only individual karma, that you do things entirely on your own, but also collective karma. And it just happens. The Second World War was waged by people, a lot of people engaging in collective karma, right? And so the collective karma then, when you have a collective karma by way of actions of body, speech, and mind, in the traditional Buddhist view, collective karma does have an impact on your environment because of the observer participancy and the whole notion of sentient beings actually creating the environments for the future, not God, not simply some external machine. And so there's an intertwining of karma and the environment that I think is very basic to Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the notion of collective karma, I'm not quite sure what you mean by
We're doing
collective
things
karma.
together with a shared volition. We have the Americans fighting the Germans, and so Americans entered into a mindset, they're the enemy, they must be conquered, as the Germans did with their enemy. People engaging things, not as a whole bunch of individuals autonomously acting as agents, but collectively, we must defeat that enemy. And so then you have a lot of people.
But that collective karma is made up of lots of individual karmas. I mean, there's no...
Sure, but the whole is greater than the parts. It always is.
Yeah.
And so that is collective. Not some. I'm not ontological. I'm not reifying it, but simply it is true that our karma is intertwined as our experience is intertwined. And the basic Buddhist view is that the Abhidhamma Koshi in Tibetan, Jikten Lala Lele Jung, the myriad worlds emerge from karma. That it's sentient beings creating the environments for the future, not God, not a mindless machine. And so there's a real participancy there. I think it's fairly
But that's creating the physical world.
Say again?
I mean, this is the idea, the Bhaja Loka. I mean, it's creating the physical world in some way, yeah.
I'm not
which is not quite the collective unconscious.
I don't go to collective
okay,
and
right,
you didn't
okay.
ask that either. That came from the backbenchers.
But then there might be one person in that collective thing, supposing who says we're not going to go to war, we're going to...
It does happen, sure.
So if there is an enlightened person who just, in a balanced state, who just says, wait, we don't need to act, then that could affect the collective.
Absolutely it
That's
does.
what I meant.
For better and worse. Hitler was one guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Influenced an awful lot of other people. Sure.
We haven't yet had the other.
Here and there.
Except for the Dalai
Oh,
Lama.
you have South Africa.
Oh, yes.
Mandela.
Mandela.
How is that for a spectacular
That's a
example?
very good example.
I think it's a wonderful example, yeah.
Lena, yeah.
Thank you. Well, currently the temptation to ask you to expand a little bit more on what is the understanding of what Buddha and enlightenment is within this model, because I'm quite familiar with the Yogacara view of what constitutes Buddha and enlightenment, but don't really have an understanding here. And from the point of view of you sort of talking about 1, 2, and 3, sort of unskillful modes of mind versus the fourth one, which is a sort of wholesome. Is this the path towards enlightenment, or is that includes the enlightenment stage as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the basic idea that we have a choice between wholesome minds and unwholesome minds that I set up is common to all Buddhism, right? So, and again, I think I always hesitate to say things that apply to all Buddhism. But I mean, the basic idea that in Buddhist practice, you are trying to create conditions for the wholesome mind to flourish. Again, I think is common to all Buddhism. So the point is, what happens when you succeed? So eventually you reach a point where you break a point of breakthrough, and that is, you wake up and you see things how they are, and your consciousness, or the way your mind works. Well, according to this model, there's a way in which the Buddha, after he gained enlightenment, according to this model, he carried on thinking, he carried on walking about, he carried on smelling, seeing, tasting things.
This process still carries
So this
on.
process carried on for the Buddha.
But you're
But-
aware of the process.
Sorry?
You see the process clearly, you're aware of
Well,
the
he
process.
understood how it worked. Or the enlightened mind sees this process and it understands how it works, is the basic point. And when you see through it, the way, I mean, to use an ancient simile, I mean, this is what builds our house. This builds the world, the mind and body we look in. And the Buddha understands the process, or any enlightened being sees through the process of constructing who you are. But of course, and then once you've seen through it, it carries on for a while, right?
Comes the laundry.
So the Buddha carried on for a while, for 40 years, teaching and whatever, and then it stopped.
What does that mean?
But-
What does that mean?
But before we go to that, could I just quickly ask, what happens? What is Buddha aware between the moments of perception? So
Exactly.
let's say for us it's bhavanga.
So the Buddha is the same. The Buddha is the same. The Buddha has a bhavanga chitta too.
So bhavanga chitta would be again the previous.
The Buddha's bhavanga chitta would be the state of mind he was in just before he descended from the heaven of the 33, the tushita heaven to
So within this model, which aspect of the mind allows this awareness to arise?
what awareness of what? Sorry.
What enables the mind of any individual to get to this under the threshold of awareness level when you start not just seeing the superficial movie, but you start seeing the frames? So in this model, what aspect of the mind that we are cultivating enables you to go under, enables you to reduce your moments of awareness to such an extent that you're able to detect the snapshots?
Well, it's not. I'm not sure that detecting the snapshots is precisely what it's about. It's understanding the process of conditioning, why things arise and fall, it's understanding, if you like, causality. It's understanding, in traditional Buddhist doctrinal terms, dependent origination, praticca samutpada, in some way. It's seeing that process. And what allows you to understand it is a mind that has faith, mindfulness, I've used this shame, regard for concepts, non-attachment, lack of hatred, balance, tranquility of body, all these things, compassion, sympathy, joy, and wisdom. That is what allows you to understand those things.
So there's no additional qualities, just
So a Buddha just develops those qualities. When you develop all those qualities to their full, you will see. If you look in the right way, in the right direction, I suppose, is what is claimed.
And then going to where Alan was taking it, if you can take it there.
So the Buddha died, then what?
Well, I mean, there are different traditions about when people talk. There are different Buddhist conceptions of what happened, or not what happened, but how we should conceive of then what. And that's, I suppose, where you get into a realm where, well, I use the word, it's kind of Buddhist theology, if you like. I mean, it's you produce different models or different ways of talking about that kind of reality, if you like. One model is to say very little in response to then what. And I think that's in early Buddhist texts there is that tendency. In some later Indian Buddhist traditions, people formulate slightly different ways of talking about that. I mean, Dhammakaya and different conceptions of the Buddha and so forth. I think it's very difficult to, we choose the model we are attracted to, I think.
So within this model, is there any particular view? I'm just curious about this model because I don't know about it.
Well, this reflects the tradition of once the Buddha has died, you should not say he exists. You should not say he does not exist. You should not say he both exists nor does not exist. And you should not say he neither exists nor does not exist. And if you remember, that is precisely the Chatushkoti of Madhyamaka.
Yeah. We arrive at the same place. Yes, because in a way you can fit all of this very conveniently in how the brain works. But that's when the question arises: when the brain's gone, what's then? So that's when the kind of reductive materialism hits its limit. When we start language, talk about language is unable to express what's then, and all the brain models become a bit shaky and wobbly and trying to.
Yes, I have a question. In Vedanta and Yoga, there's a tradition where sufficient experience of objectless samadhi, as you have that experience, what they call the seeds of past karma get cooked. And the sort of storehouse of past experiences, their effects, they have what can imagine a bunch of springs with shells on them. And sufficient experience of samadhi, they start heating them up, as their image, warming them up, and then they are released. And then you get to a period where they're all cooked. And so you still have past karma, otherwise you wouldn't be breathing, sitting, walking around or anything. But that karma is no longer what we might call distorted. It does not have its own latent, unresolved dynamisms. And that's how the right-hand column is then the spontaneous result of that. Now, is there anything comparable? I would usually, when I look and talk to people, just about everything I find comparable. Is there anything comparable in your knowledge to that happening? That there's two things. One is practice, but separate from practice, there is a causal effect of samadhi, which then yields these effects too.
Well, yeah, I think the model is more or less what, it's very similar to what you described. I mean, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that samadhi, when you come out of samadhi, your mind is changed in some way. And eventually, of course, you attain a samadhi. And in this model, bodhi, I mean, enlightenment, is a kind of samadhi. And you attain a kind of samadhi that does something even deeper to you, yes. And that's precisely.
I would presume that the Buddhist tradition is, it's not that you come out of, this is surely Vedanta, it's not that you come out of samadhi, but the things that were obscuring the samadhi that was underneath are now gone. That's why it's called, I was taught, that's why it's called awakening. You're simply waking up to what was there and you weren't noticing. It's not that you created it. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I mean, there are slightly different directions one can push these models. I mean, going back to, one idea, of course, is that, it's the fact that our mind is flitting about looking for all sorts of different objects that we don't actually see the true nature of the mind. When you concentrate, one Buddhist practice is a kasina practice, you concentrate on a white disc. It's not because a white disc is an important thing and that you want to learn anything about that white disc. It's that simply by concentrating on a simple object, you stop the mind flitting about all the time, and that allows you to see when it stops, that's why this spontaneous happiness arises, because it's the first time you actually see the nature of mind in some kind of way.
The account of why we're flitting about, this was sort of a model I've always worked on, is the satisfaction you want is not found in other things of the same sort that you have now. You're looking in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And that I'm reflecting on your thing about novelty. The reason we want new things is the old one, though, is unsatisfactory.
Yeah.
So eventually, if you can look in the direction where some real satisfaction is there, I studied for many years with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and he had a line where you have the satisfaction of all desires, but it's very subtle.
Yeah.
It's not that all desires themselves particularly are satisfying. You have the satisfaction that was driving all those desires. It's a very interesting logic, which struck me as entirely comprehensive.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm aware that I think there are various people who've been putting up their hands. I don't know how to. I suddenly feel defeated in my practice of mindfulness for not noting who had their hand up first. I know at different points. I'm going to have to make a choice. I know you.
Please go to your three states of consciousness diagrams. What does the flat line indicate there? Is it
this one?
in the dreamless state? That means only absence of awareness and Samadhi is only awareness? What does a flat line indicate?
Well, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that, in my model, is that when you, in the ordinary waking state, right, the dip is you reacting with your past, because it's you're going into bhavanga, which is what you've taken from your past mind. It's a reflection of what you did in the past, right? So you come out of that and take a new object, conditioned by how you were in the past, as it were. You take a new object and do something new with it, and then, so this is passive and this is active. And in a way, in the dreamless state, you're resting in this passive state. There's no new object coming to the mind. So it's just you resting in the passive state. And according to the model, if you're reborn as a human being, this passive state must be basically the reflection of a good state. You must have been in a good state before you died in your previous life. So it's quite a pleasant state to be in. It's a reflection of a wholesome mind, which probably of some sort. So you're resting in that. You're not doing anything. In Samadhi, so you're just at the bottom. There's no... There are little bumps because Samadhi, consciousness is still understood as flashing, if you like, in some kind of way, but it's instances of the same type of consciousness. In Samadhi...
Let's say chitta is dissolved.
Well, it's called chitta. It's still chitta.
There's no flashing.
Well, no, but it's the same chitta flashing on, so... as it were. And it's the same in Samadhi. It's still chitta, and it's the same chitta with a same type of chitta with the same object that keeps flashing on. But it's at the peak of it's at the crest of the wave, as it were. So it's hyper. It doesn't sound right in English, does it? Hyperactive. I mean, it's hyper awake. It's not just passive. So this is you're kind of building something really useful when you're in there. Whereas in the ordinary waking state, you may be building something useful, but a lot of the time you're building things that are only going to cause you problems. Whereas in Samadhi, you're definitely making something that is understood to be very beneficial.
There is an active awareness component here, which is absent in the top one?
Yes, exactly, yes. It's understood as precisely... This is the result of past karma. This is vipaka. This is new karma. This is either kushala karma or akushala karma. Well, if it's samadhi, it's kushala karma.
In one of the slides you mentioned there's nothing like bare awareness.
Right, yeah.
Which means that the moment there's any kind of conscious activity, one has to go through those 5 steps of turning towards it.
Yeah, though they're not exactly 5 steps, they occur at a moment in the model. So there's no such thing of awareness without some additional activity like this, some additional functions like this feeling.
In Samadhi, how do you reconcile?
We have to.
Okay.
And you carry it on. Lovely talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.